I found out my husband had a secret storage unit because of a parking ticket. That's the whole reason any of this happened. If that ticket had gone to the right address, I would still be living the life I thought I had, and I would never have learned the things I'm about to tell you. We'd been married 6 years, together for 9. His name is Marcus, not his real name, obviously, and on paper, our life looked almost boringly stable. He worked in logistics for a shipping company. I taught high school biology. We had a mortgage, a dog, a running joke about who kept leaving the kitchen cabinet doors open. If you'd asked me any day before this whether I truly knew my husband, I would have laughed at the question. That's what makes the next part so hard to explain. I didn't find a crack in something I already suspected was breaking. I found a door I never knew existed, in a wall I'd been leaning against for 9 years without ever once noticing it wasn't solid. It was a Tuesday. I was going through the mail on the kitchen counter, bills, a catalog, a postcard from my sister, when I found an envelope from the county addressed to Marcus, forwarded from an old apartment he'd lived in before we met. Inside was a notice for an unpaid parking citation, issued outside a self-storage facility 40 minutes from our house, in a town neither of us had any real reason to be in. The ticket was recent, 2 weeks old. I want to be honest about my first reaction, because it wasn't suspicion. It was confusion. Marcus didn't have a storage unit. We'd emptied the one unit we'd ever shared from our very first apartment together, years ago. I remembered it specifically because we'd argued about whether to keep his old college furniture, and I'd won. I texted him a photo of the citation with a question mark. He didn't respond for 3 hours, which wasn't unusual. He was often in warehouses with no signal. When he finally called that evening, his voice had a strange flatness to it, the kind of calm that takes visible effort to hold in place. "Oh, that," he said. "It's for work. Overflow storage for some samples. I forgot to update the address on it. I'll handle the ticket." It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, I would learn, the first of many reasonable explanations that turned out to be exactly the kind of thing people say when the truth isn't available to them yet. I let it go. For about 11 days, I actually let it go. And I want you to understand that this wasn't naivety. It was trust, the kind you build over 9 years, the kind that doesn't dissolve over one strange envelope. The second thing was smaller, almost nothing on its own. I was syncing our shared budgeting app, the one we'd used for years to track the mortgage and the groceries and the dog's absurd vet bills, and I noticed a recurring charge I'd apparently scrolled past 100 times without ever really registering it. $84 a month, auto-drafted from an account I didn't recognize, labeled only with a short code, STRG-4471. I asked him about it over dinner, casually, the way you ask about something you assume has a boring answer. He said it was the storage unit from work, same as the ticket. I asked which account it was coming from, since it wasn't our joint checking. He said it was an old personal account he kept for work reimbursements, something his company had set up years ago and never bothered to close. Here's the detail that took me 2 more weeks to notice, and once I noticed it, I could not stop noticing it. $84 a month, charged on the 3rd of every month. Going back, I checked every statement I could find. 68 months. 68 months is 5 years and 8 months. We had been together for 9 years, married for 6. 68 months put the very first charge at almost exactly 3 years before we met. Marcus had been paying for a storage unit without a single gap for 3 years before he even knew I existed, all the way through our entire relationship, and he had never once mentioned it to me in 9 years. I want to walk you through the thinking, because I think it matters for understanding why I didn't confront him immediately, and I've read enough of these stories myself to know people always want to know why. I told myself it could genuinely be nothing, an old unit from a previous relationship, sentimental items he was embarrassed to explain, boxes from a parent who'd passed. I told myself that people keep strange things private, not because they're hiding something monstrous, but because some things simply never come up in 9 years. The same way I'd never once mentioned the year I quit marching band, or the ex-boyfriend I dated for 4 months in college, whose last name I genuinely couldn't have told you if you'd asked me under oath. But $84 a month isn't a box of old yearbooks. Climate-controlled units, the kind that run that much monthly, are for things that need protecting. Documents, electronics, furniture, Things a person is actively maintaining rather than simply forgetting about in the back of a garage. And he had lied about the account. Not misremembered, lied. I checked our joint tax filings going back years. There was no work reimbursement account anywhere in any shared financial history we'd ever had. He'd invented a detail on the spot, smoothly, the way you invent something only after years of practice not having to explain it to anyone. I didn't say anything for 19 more days. I went to work. I graded labs. I walked the dog. I lay next to him every night with a question sitting in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed whole. And I said nothing, because some part of me understood, the way you understand weather changing before the sky actually shows it, that once I asked the real question, there would be no version of my life that went back to how it was an hour before I asked it. I found the facility's exact address through the parking citation itself, which listed the location of the violation, the lot directly outside a self-storage complex, off a highway exit I'd driven past 100 times without ever once turning toward it. I didn't tell Marcus I was going. I told him I had a dentist appointment on a Thursday afternoon, which was true. I did have one at 11, and I moved my whole day around it so the lie would have a real appointment sitting inside it, in case he ever checked. I have never in my life planned a lie that carefully, and I want you to understand how unlike me that was, and how much that alone told me about what I already believed I was going to find behind that door. The facility was exactly what you'd picture. Beige metal buildings, a keypad gate, a bored attendant behind bulletproof glass who didn't ask a single question when I said I was picking something up for my husband and gave him the unit number off the citation. I don't think places like that are required to verify much of anything. I think that's the entire point of them. Unit 4471 was in the back row, second from the end. It had his padlock on it. I recognized the brand instantly, because we had the exact same one on our garage at home. A detail so small and so domestic that it almost made me turn around right there in the hallway. A man who lies to you for years still, apparently, buys the same brand of lock for his secrets that he buys for his lawnmower. I didn't have the key, and I want to be clear about that, because a version of this story exists in my head where I broke in, and that isn't what happened. I stood in front of that door for maybe 4 minutes, and then I did the only thing that actually made sense to me in that moment. I called him. He picked up on the second ring, mid-workday, warehouse noise humming behind him. I said, "I'm standing in front of Unit 4471. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I heard him step somewhere quieter, a door closing, the warehouse sound dropping away completely. "You went there," he said, not a question. "I need you to tell me what's in there, Marcus, right now, on this phone, before I go home and we have to sit across a table from each other pretending I don't already know something is wrong." There was another silence, and in it, every terrible possibility I'd built over 19 sleepless nights ran through my head at once, all at the same time. Another woman, another family, another life entirely, some version of him I'd never been allowed to meet, living 40 minutes away in a 5x10 unit with a matching garage lock. Then he said, quietly, "It's not what you think. Please don't go in there without me. I'll leave right now. Give me 40 minutes. I'll explain everything. I promise you, I will explain every single thing." I sat in my car in that parking lot for 41 minutes. I did not go in. I want to be honest that a large part of why I didn't wasn't restraint. It was fear. Some part of me understood that whatever was behind that door, once I saw it without him there to frame it first, I would never again be able to hear his explanation as anything other than a performance for an audience who already knew the ending. He arrived still in his work clothes, out of breath, like he had genuinely run from his car. He unlocked the unit with his hands shaking badly enough that it took him 2 tries, and he rolled the door up himself before I could reach for it, almost as if he needed to be the one to reveal it, rather than let me discover it on my own. It wasn't another woman. It wasn't another family. I need to tell you that clearly, because I know exactly where every listener's mind goes at this point, because it's precisely where mine had gone for 19 days straight. It was medical equipment. A hospital bed, disassembled and wrapped carefully in plastic. Boxes labeled in careful handwriting that wasn't his. A woman's handwriting, looping and old-fashioned. A wheelchair, folded flat against the wall. Photo albums stacked 3 deep along one side, and in the very back, under a dust sheet, a dresser I recognized instantly, because it was in every single photo Marcus had ever shown me of the house he grew up in. "It's my mother's," he said. "All of it." I knew Marcus's mother had passed away 4 years before we met. He told me that early on, briefly, the way people tell you the shorthand version of grief they've already folded into a small, manageable shape. "Cancer," he'd said, fast, near the end. He didn't like to talk about it, and I had never once pushed, because I understood what it was to have a parent's death be a door you keep mostly closed, out of respect as much as anything else. What he told me that afternoon, sitting on an overturned box in a storage unit 40 minutes from our home, was the part he had never folded small enough to hand to anyone, including me. His mother hadn't died quickly. She'd been sick for almost 3 years before the end, and for most of that time, 17-year-old and then 20-year-old Marcus had been her only real caretaker, because his father had left years earlier and there was no one else standing in the gap. He'd managed her medical equipment, her medications, her hospital bed, entirely alone, while going to community college part-time and working nights just to keep the lights on. When she finally died, he was 23, completely alone and utterly unable to throw any of it away. Not the bed he'd assembled himself at 19 with an instruction manual and a borrowed drill. Not the wheelchair he'd learned to fold in under a minute so he could get her to appointments faster when she was too tired to wait. Not the boxes of her handwriting, recipe cards and old letters, and a half-finished journal she never got to close out. He'd rented the unit the month she died, and in almost 9 years, he had never once been able to make himself go back and empty it. "I didn't lie to hurt you," he said. "I lied because I didn't know how to explain that I've been paying to keep my dead mother's hospital bed in storage for 8 years, and that I still can't make myself get rid of it, and that some part of me was terrified that if you saw this, you'd think there was something wrong with me, something broken that I couldn't fix, and that you couldn't fix either, no matter how hard you tried. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling at all. My first feeling, standing in that unit, wasn't relief. It was something closer to grief. Grief for the version of him that had carried this completely alone for 9 years, sitting next to me every single night, saying nothing, while I built increasingly elaborate stories in my head about a life he wasn't secretly living at all. I was also, and I don't think this makes me a bad person, still angry. Not about the storage unit itself, about the lie regarding the account, the invented work reimbursement, the smooth, practiced way he deflected a direct question with a false answer rather than even a small piece of the truth. He could have said, "It's private, I'll explain later," and I would have waited. I would have given him all the time in the world. Instead, he chose to construct something false, and that choice had nothing to do with his mother. That choice was entirely about what he'd decided, on his own, that I could and couldn't handle, without ever once asking me. We didn't fix it that day. We sat on the floor of that storage unit for almost 2 hours while he told me things about those 3 years I'd never once heard. The night she fell and he couldn't lift her alone and had to call an ambulance he genuinely couldn't afford. The last real conversation they ever had before she stopped recognizing him entirely. And the exact date every year that he still marks privately, quietly. A date I had shared a home with him for 6 years without ever knowing its significance. We went to therapy after that, both individually and together, which I'd never in 100 years have predicted a parking ticket could set into motion. I learned that Marcus had built an entire architecture of small, protective lies over the years. Nothing catastrophic in any single one of them, but each one carefully designed to keep me from ever having to see the parts of him he'd long ago decided were too much for anyone to carry alongside him. And I learned, more slowly and with more discomfort, that I had made it easier for him to believe that than I wanted to admit, because I'd built a quieter version of the exact same wall myself, for reasons that took me a lot longer to untangle than his did. We emptied the unit 8 months later, together. On a weekend I took off work specifically for it. We kept the recipe cards and the journal and a handful of photographs. We donated the hospital bed and the wheelchair to a hospice organization that refurbishes equipment for families who can't afford it new, which felt like the only ending that actually made sense out of any of it. The dresser sits in our guest room now, and I dust it every week, and I've never once told him that I do that, and maybe I never will, because some things I've learned really do just live quietly inside a marriage without ever needing to be explained. I still think, more often than I probably should, about the version of that afternoon where I go into the unit alone, before he arrives, and build the wrong story out of the right evidence. Because the evidence really did look, from the outside, exactly like every worst thing I could possibly have imagined. I think about how close I came to walking away from 9 years over a lie that was quietly protecting grief instead of covering betrayal, and how the only reason I didn't was that I gave him 41 minutes to explain himself before I let my own imagination finish writing the story on its own terms. I don't think every secret deserves that much patience. I've come to believe that most of them probably don't. I think mine, as it turned out, happened to.